They say that power leaves traces on a person's face, that the weight of decisions, wars, and betrayals carves itself into wrinkles and hardened expressions. Yet before the scars of history set in, before fame turned them into marble statues in the collective imagination, world leaders were once simply children. The rare photographs that capture them in these forgotten years tell stories that official biographies often brush past. They show vulnerability, innocence, and sometimes the foreshadowing of ambition or cruelty hidden in the eyes of a boy or girl who had no idea what destiny had in store. These images, often tucked away in family albums, hidden in archives, or rarely seen by the public, force us to confront a truth: the architects of revolutions, wars, and empires were once as ordinary as the rest of us. Take Winston Churchill, remembered now as the Bulldog of Britain, the wartime prime minister who defied Hitler and rallied his nation with stubborn grit. Few would imagine that as a child he was frail, often ill, and overshadowed by a distant father and a glamorous mother who left him in the care of others. In one rare photograph, Churchill appears small and almost fragile, his eyes uncertain as he poses stiffly in an oversized outfit. The child in the picture seems far removed from the cigar-smoking, defiant man the world would later celebrate. And yet, perhaps, his lonely childhood, shaped by a constant yearning for parental approval, planted the seeds of the relentless drive that made him impossible to ignore when history called. Joseph Stalin's childhood tells a darker tale. Born Ioseb Zugashvili in a poor Georgian town, his early photos are striking not only for their rarity but for the haunting quality in his gaze. His father was abusive, his mother harsh and deeply religious, and his childhood was marred by illness and poverty. There is a famous portrait of Stalin as a young boy with thick hair and an intense stare. At first glance, it looks like any other child's photograph, but knowing what came later, the purges, the gulags, the millions of lives extinguished, the picture takes on an almost chilling quality. In that child's eyes, historians often remark, you can already sense the hardness that would one day define him. The photo becomes more than an artifact, it becomes a window into the shaping of a dictator who grew up believing that survival meant ruthlessness. Contrast this with Mahatma Gandhi, whose childhood image tells a different kind of story. Dressed neatly in his school uniform, with wide, earnest eyes and a shy expression, young Gandhi looks almost timid, the kind of boy easily overlooked in a classroom. He was deeply influenced by the traditions of his religious household, bound by ritual and expectation. Few could have predicted that this quiet child, who once struggled with shyness and even feared speaking in public, would later lead one of the greatest nonviolent resistance movements the world has ever seen. The photograph captures not strength, but vulnerability, a reminder that the transformation from child to leader is often built on confronting one's deepest insecurities. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's childhood portraits reflect privilege rather than hardship. Born into wealth, young FDR is often pictured in finely tailored clothes, standing confidently in well-manicured gardens or posed in formal family portraits. The photographs radiate security, a stark contrast to those of leaders born into poverty or chaos. Yet the comfort of his upbringing would be tested by personal tragedy when polio struck him in adulthood, reshaping his outlook and forcing resilience. The boy in the early photographs, who seemed destined for an easy life, would eventually carry the weight of guiding America through the Great Depression and World War II. His childhood photos are significant not for what they reveal of hardship, but for how they contrast with the trials he would later endure. Adolf Hitler, on the other hand, is captured in a series of unsettlingly ordinary photographs as a young boy in Austria. One in particular shows him dressed neatly in a small suit, with combed hair and a somewhat blank expression. He appears like any other child of the era, perhaps even angelic in his youth. The ordinary quality of the photo is what makes it disturbing, for it reminds us that monstrous figures are not born with the shadow of evil already visible. They emerge from the same innocence that defines every childhood. The photograph of young Hitler is a sobering reminder that the distance between childhood vulnerability and adult destructiveness can be both small and invisible. Nelson Mandela's childhood photos tell a different kind of story yet again. Raised in the rural village of Mvizo in South Africa, his rare childhood images often show him in traditional attire, barefoot, surrounded by the landscapes of his Xhosa heritage. In these photographs, there is no indication that the boy would grow up to challenge the most entrenched system of racial oppression in modern history. His eyes carry curiosity rather than defiance, a boy shaped by oral traditions and rural simplicity, unaware of the prison walls and political battles that would define his adult life. The contrast between the boy in the photos and the global icon of justice he became demonstrates how destiny can take even the most unlikely paths. Margaret Thatcher, who would one day be known as the Iron Lady of British politics, also has photographs from her early years that seem disarmingly normal. In one, she sits primly as a young girl, dressed neatly in modest clothes, her posture straight, her gaze attentive. She was the daughter of a grocer, raised in a disciplined environment that emphasized work ethic and self-control. The photograph does not suggest the fiery politician who would rise to power in a male-dominated arena, breaking barriers with sheer determination. Instead, it captures a child molded by discipline and duty, the seeds of her future toughness quietly embedded in the routine of her upbringing. Barack Obama's early photographs offer a glimpse into a boyhood marked by both warmth and displacement. There are images of him smiling alongside his mother in Hawaii, photographs of him with his Indonesian stepfather, and snapshots of a young boy navigating different worlds and identities. The photographs reveal both joy and transience, reflecting a childhood where belonging was often questioned. The boy in these images would one day stand on a stage proclaiming hope and unity, his childhood experiences of difference and multiculturalism transformed into a political message that resonated across the globe. What unites these rare childhood photographs is their ability to strip away the aura of inevitability. They remind us that leaders are not born with power etched into their faces. They were children first, children who played, stumbled, laughed, cried, and endured. The contrast between the fragile child in the photograph and the hardened leader they became later in life creates a powerful tension. It forces us to ask how much of leadership is written by circumstance, by trauma, by privilege, or by pure chance. Looking into the eyes of these children, frozen in rare photographs, we are invited to reflect not only on their personal journeys but on the haunting reality that within every child lies the possibility of greatness, tragedy, or infamy. These photos, fragile as they may be, are silent witnesses to the hidden beginnings of power. Before power hardened them, before speeches and declarations were etched into history, many world leaders were simply students. Rare photographs from those formative years reveal not polished politicians or feared revolutionaries, but curious young men and women navigating lecture halls, dorm rooms, and smoky cafes. These images capture their uncertainty, their intellectual hunger, their friendships, and their occasional recklessness. Looking at them, it becomes clear that greatness often begins not with destiny laid out neatly, but with restless youth pushing against the boundaries of the ordinary. To see them as students is to catch them in the fragile, dangerous stage where ideas are first planted, when the seeds of both inspiration and destruction are sown. Vladimir Lenin, long before the name Lenin became synonymous with revolution, was simply Vladimir Ulyanov, a restless young student in the Russian Empire. In one rare photograph, he appears serious and composed, dressed plainly, the faint shadow of defiance already visible in his expression. His years as a law student in Kazan were cut short when he was expelled for joining a protest. That expulsion changed everything. It forced him into underground circles where radical ideas thrived. The photograph of young Lenin does not yet scream revolutionary, but history tells us that those years of reading banned books and writing feverishly in notebooks would ignite a movement that toppled an empire. In that student's face, we see the tension between discipline and rebellion, between order and the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Fidel Castro's student days were equally revealing. Long before he entered Havana as the bearded revolutionary leader, he was photographed as a tall, handsome law student, often in sports attire or debating passionately with his peers. His early photographs show him with friends, youthful and carefree, yet the stories behind them reveal a young man restless with political energy. At the University of Havana, he was notorious for his fiery speeches, his willingness to challenge authority, and his flirtations with radical politics. The images of Castro during this period show not a hardened revolutionary, but a charismatic young man caught between academia and activism, already rehearsing the role he would later play on the world stage. He looked like an ordinary student, yet every gesture hinted at a man preparing for a fight far larger than himself. Angela Merkel's student photographs tell a different kind of story. In East Germany, before the Berlin Wall fell, she was not yet a chancellor or the most powerful woman in the world, but a quiet, determined physics student. Rare photographs show her with friends, sitting among piles of books, or dressed casually in the modest clothing typical of East German youth. Unlike the fiery student activists of other nations, Merkel's rebellion was quiet, found in her pursuit of knowledge in a system that limited free thought. The young Merkel, with her focus on quantum chemistry and science, seemed destined for an academic career. Yet even in those images, her seriousness and composure stand out, traits that later defined her as a steady leader in turbulent times. The photographs of her university years are proof that leadership can be shaped in silence as much as in protest. Barack Obama's student years are perhaps among the most photographed and relatable in modern history. Before he became the 44th President of the United States, there was Barry, the lanky young man with a warm smile and a cigarette in hand, captured in candid photos at Occidental College and later at Harvard Law School. Images of him lounging with friends, deep in conversation, or editing the Harvard Law Review show a man who was simultaneously searching for identity and shaping his voice. These photos remind us that Obama's power did not spring forth fully formed. It was honed in late-night debates, in classrooms where he argued passionately about justice, and in moments of self-reflection as he straddled different worlds of culture and identity. The youthful Barack in those photographs looks like any other student, yet destiny was already nudging him toward history. Che Guevara, remembered globally as the romanticized face of revolution, appears in early photographs as a young medical student in Argentina. In one rare picture, he is seen bent over books, preparing for exams, his face calm, his hair neat, nothing like the wild-haired gorilla who would later become a global icon. Yet his student years were transformative. His medical training sharpened his sense of empathy for human suffering, while his travels as a young man exposed him to poverty and injustice across Latin America. The photos of Guevara at this stage are deeply ironic, a man devoted to science and healing, unaware that the next photographs taken of him would be with rifles slung over his shoulder in the jungles of Cuba. The quiet student with a stethoscope would one day become the revolutionary with a beret. Even Martin Luther King Jr. was once a young student with a shy, boyish face. Rare photographs capture him during his seminary and university years, sitting with books or walking across campus, suited and dignified, but still clearly in the process of becoming. These images are powerful because they strip away the myth of the orator who moved nations and show instead the disciplined, determined student who devoured philosophy and theology. The rare photographs of him smiling with classmates or looking contemplative in study halls remind us that the leader of the civil rights movement was first a dreamer, a young man building the intellectual and moral foundation for a struggle that would change America. The rarest of these student photographs often carry a haunting quality. They remind us that the powerful were not born as monuments, they were shaped in the uncertainty of classrooms, in whispered conversations with friends, in books devoured late at night. The ordinary details captured in these photos, the way a future president sits casually on library steps, the way a future dictator clutches a notebook, the way a future activist leans into a heated debate, are clues to the making of history. Each rare image whispers a contradiction, that the most extraordinary paths often begin in the most ordinary places. What strikes us most is how easily these young men and women could have remained anonymous. A wrong turn, a failed exam, a quiet choice to step away from politics, and their names might have been forgotten like countless others. Their student photographs, then, are not just curiosities, they are fragile records of the moment before history claimed them. Looking at these images, we are reminded of a universal truth, that behind every leader is a student who once sat in the back of a classroom, scribbling notes, wondering, like all young people, what kind of life lay ahead. These photos freeze the moment before the answer was written, before the dream hardened into destiny. They are portraits not just of students, but of dreamers on the edge of becoming. Before they stood on podiums, before they signed treaties or commanded nations, many of the most recognizable world leaders wore uniforms, not suits. Their youthful faces, preserved in rare wartime photographs, tell a story of vulnerability and duty. Some were drafted unwillingly, others rushed toward the battlefield with conviction, and still others found themselves tested in ways that forever shaped their visions of power. To see them as young soldiers is to see them stripped of authority, standing shoulder to shoulder with ordinary men, not yet set apart by history. These photographs are haunting because they remind us that before they commanded armies, they were once pawns within them. John F. Kennedy is one of the most iconic examples. Today his image is associated with the polished elegance of the White House, but as a young man in World War II, he was simply Jack, a naval officer leading a small crew aboard PT-109. Rare photographs show him in uniform, lean, confident, with the boyish charm that later won him a nation's heart. Yet behind the smile was a man living on borrowed time. When his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, Kennedy swam miles through shark-infested waters to save his crew, dragging one injured sailor by holding the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. The photo of him in uniform, when viewed with this story in mind, takes on an entirely different dimension. It is no longer just a portrait of a young officer, but an early glimpse of the resilience and courage that would define his presidency. Charles de Gaulle, long before he became the voice of Free France, was a young officer in the First World War. In one rare photograph, he stands stiffly in uniform, his posture formal, his eyes reflecting a certain hauteur even in youth. He was captured by the Germans in 1916 and spent years as a prisoner of war, attempting escape multiple times. These photographs show not a national hero but a soldier marked by humiliation and endurance. The de Gaulle we see here is not yet the proud general of 1940, but a young man experiencing firsthand the fragility of armies and the chaos of war. Those early years of captivity instilled in him the fierce independence that later allowed him to defy occupation and refuse surrender. His youthful uniform photographs foreshadow the defiance of a leader who refused to accept defeat. Perhaps no image is more chilling than that of Adolf Hitler in World War I. In photographs from the Bavarian army, he looks almost unrecognizable, thin, mustached, a face blending into the ranks of thousands of other soldiers. At the time, he was a messenger, risking his life carrying communications between trenches. Wounded twice, decorated for bravery, the young Hitler was far from the dictator who would plunge the world into its darkest conflict. These photos of him as a soldier are disturbing precisely because of their ordinariness. He looks like any other weary face in the mud of the Great War, anonymous among millions. It is the knowledge of what followed that turns the photograph into a warning. The boyish soldier who once posed quietly for a wartime portrait would later unleash destruction on a scale beyond comprehension. Kim Il-sung, long before he became the supreme leader of North Korea, was photographed as a guerrilla fighter in his youth. His rare images from the 1930s show him in ragged military attire, part of the resistance against Japanese occupation. The young man in those photographs is not yet the carefully cultivated icon of propaganda, but a wiry, determined fighter living in the mountains, hardened by cold and hunger. The photographs give an unvarnished look at a youth consumed by the harsh realities of survival. In these images, the seeds of his later obsession with militarization and control are visible. The boy who fought with a small band of rebels would one day command one of the most secretive and militarized states in history. Even Franklin D. Roosevelt, usually remembered in civilian suits and hats, dabbled in military culture as a young man. Though he never saw combat himself, he served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I and was often photographed in naval attire. These photographs, often overlooked, show a man eager to project strength and solidarity with the military. Standing beside officers, looking youthful and ambitious, FDR's images reveal a man fascinated by power structures and deeply aware of the role the military would play in shaping nations. The photos remind us that even indirect associations with military life left impressions that guided his later leadership through global war. Another striking example is Mikhail Gorbachev, long before he became the reformer who ended the Cold War. As a young man, he served briefly in the Soviet military during the early 1950s. Rare photographs show him in uniform, clean-cut, disciplined, looking like thousands of other young Soviet recruits. There is no hint in those photographs of the man who would one day dismantle the system he once served. The images of Gorbachev in his uniform stand as quiet contradictions, proof that history often grows out of experiences that seem ordinary or insignificant at the time. And then there are the photographs of Joseph Tito, the future leader of Yugoslavia, in the trenches of World War I, captured by the Russians and later joining the Communist Party. His early images show a young man in ill-fitting uniform, his eyes already hardened by the brutality of the front. Tito's military photographs highlight the brutal education that war provided, an education in suffering, loyalty, and the fragility of empires. These lessons later shaped his ability to hold together a fragile federation of ethnic groups under his rule. What binds these rare photographs together is the paradox they reveal. The young soldier is both vulnerable and dangerous, both ordinary and extraordinary. A uniform makes them part of a collective, indistinguishable from the masses. Yet when we know their names, the photographs gain a sharp edge. We cannot unsee the future in their eyes. We cannot look at young Kennedy without thinking of Dallas, or at young Hitler without seeing the shadow of Auschwitz, or at young de Gaulle without hearing the echo of Vive la France libre. These images disturb us because they remind us that soldiers are not born as generals or presidents. They are made, through mud, blood, and survival. The photographs of leaders as soldiers carry a haunting intimacy. They are frozen moments when the individuals who would later command the destinies of millions were themselves just faces in the crowd, subject to orders, dependent on luck, not yet wielders of history but survivors of it. Looking at them is a reminder that power is not inherited like a crown, but forged in the crucible of experience, sometimes on battlefields where anonymity hides the future giants of the world. These rare photographs whisper the truth: before they shaped wars, they were shaped by them. For all the speeches, rallies, wars, and power struggles that define their legacies, world leaders were not always figures of politics or revolution. They were also sons, daughters, husbands, wives, lovers, and parents. Rare photographs that capture these leaders in moments of intimacy and domestic life reveal a side of history that feels almost forbidden, ordinary tenderness glimpsed in people we usually remember as cold, unapproachable, or fearsome. These photographs are compelling because they humanize the inhuman, stripping away the armor of politics to reveal the raw simplicity of love and family. To see them smiling with children, holding hands with a partner, or standing in relaxed family portraits is to be reminded that behind every iron facade was a beating heart, at least for a time. Mao Zedong, remembered as the architect of communist China, a man whose policies reshaped millions of lives and cost millions more, appears in some early photographs with his wives and children. One striking image shows him in his youth, standing with his second wife, Yang Kai-hui, during a time when his revolutionary zeal was just beginning to take form. The photograph is almost disarming. He looks calm, almost playful, with none of the hardened expression that later became his signature. Yang Kai-hui would eventually be executed by nationalist forces, and her loss haunted Mao throughout his life. These rare family photographs remind us that even the most ruthless of leaders once knew domestic happiness, and that history's violence often intrudes directly into the most intimate bonds. Margaret Thatcher, often remembered as the Iron Lady, is captured in rare images of her early domestic life that contradict her political persona. Long before she stood at the dispatch box in Parliament or clashed with unions, she was photographed in her modest kitchen as a young mother, wearing an apron while tending to her children, Mark and Carol. These photos show a softer Thatcher, smiling in candid moments, balancing the responsibilities of family with the beginnings of her political career. For a woman remembered for her toughness, these glimpses of family life add a striking layer of contrast. They show how the ordinary duties of motherhood existed alongside her ambitions, and how the woman who would later command armies of bureaucrats once commanded the simple domestic sphere. Bill Clinton, often portrayed in history books as a charismatic and controversial political figure, appears in youthful photographs with Hillary Rodham, the brilliant law student he met at Yale. In one rare image, the two are seen laughing together on campus grounds, their bond already apparent. At that time, they were just ambitious young people with dreams, unaware that they would one day occupy the White House together and weather storms of scandal and scrutiny. These early photographs freeze the innocence of their partnership, capturing love before the weight of political life tested it. They are reminders that behind the global headlines was a couple whose relationship was once defined by simple, unguarded affection. Vladimir Putin, so often remembered for his stern demeanor and carefully constructed image as a strongman, is caught in youthful family photographs that feel almost alien to his later myth. One rare image shows him with his wife, Ludmila, during the early years of their marriage, smiling while on a vacation. Another shows him holding his daughters, looking far removed from the secretive, guarded figure who would later dominate Russian politics. These photographs shock precisely because they contradict the narrative of the ever-watchful, ever-powerful Putin. They reveal a man who once allowed himself to be photographed in private moments, relaxed, almost ordinary. Even leaders remembered for their activism and public courage, such as Nelson Mandela, have rare family photographs that soften their larger-than-life image. In early snapshots, he can be seen with his young wife, Evelyn Mays, and their children before prison, exile, and politics consumed his life. These images radiate warmth, capturing Mandela before he became a global icon of resistance. He is not yet the elder statesman but a young man sitting with his family, his children clambering around him, laughter in his eyes. These rare photographs remind us that Mandela's journey was not only political but personal, filled with sacrifices that cost him decades of family life during his imprisonment. Indira Gandhi, remembered as India's Iron Woman, also appears in family portraits with her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, and her sons. The photographs of her as a mother are strikingly different from her political images. In them, she looks protective, warm, often smiling gently at her children. These candid photographs reveal her vulnerability, a side often hidden in the glare of politics where she appeared calculating and commanding. The juxtaposition of these domestic images with her later reputation underscores the complexity of her character, suggesting that even leaders who appear unyielding in public bear private burdens of love and family. And then there are photographs of figures like Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, not in the Oval Office but in quiet domestic settings, smiling together on porches or surrounded by their children. These photographs strip away the grandeur of politics, showing a marriage that endured its share of difficulties but also its share of private warmth. In these images, the Roosevelts are not yet the couple guiding America through its darkest crises, but partners navigating family life in moments of rare normality. What makes these photographs so haunting is the contrast they draw with the legacies that followed. Mao's tenderness with his wife sits uneasily beside the tragedies of his rule. Thatcher's smile in her kitchen feels almost irreconcilable with her reputation as a ruthless political operator. Putin's casual family snapshots clash with the carefully constructed image of control and secrecy that later defined him. Mandela's warmth with his children feels poignant in light of the years stolen from him by prison walls. The photographs speak in whispers, telling us that even the most commanding figures once knew moments of softness that history has no room for. Ultimately, these rare images remind us that power is only one dimension of a life. Behind the speeches, the policies, and the conflicts are lives once marked by the same domestic joys and struggles as any other. These glimpses of leaders in love, in marriage, and in family life are both comforting and unsettling. Comforting, because they show humanity where history has trained us to see only power. Unsettling, because they remind us that love and cruelty, tenderness and ruthlessness, can coexist within the same person. To look at these photographs is to glimpse a truth often forgotten, that the people who changed the course of nations also changed diapers, held hands, wrote love letters, and tucked their children into bed. In these moments, power retreats, and humanity emerges. History often remembers leaders as if they were destined for greatness, as though their rise was inevitable, written into the fabric of time. Yet when we look closely at the rare photographs taken before their fame, what emerges is not inevitability but obscurity. These men and women were not born onto the stage of history fully formed. They stumbled, they failed, they worked menial jobs, they faced rejection and ridicule. Their rare photographs from these forgotten years do not show leaders at podiums or generals on horses but struggling artists, awkward performers, exhausted workers, and idealists barely holding on to their dreams. These are the pictures of history before it recognized them, before the world knew their names. And it is in this obscurity that we glimpse their most human selves. Perhaps the most infamous example is Adolf Hitler in his years as a failed artist in Vienna. Long before he rose to power, photographs of him in modest suits and shabby boarding houses capture a man drifting in the margins of society. He sold cheap watercolor paintings to scrape by, often rejected by art schools, mocked by peers, and struggling with poverty. In these images, he appears thin, ordinary, sometimes awkwardly posed. The weight of history makes these photos almost unbearable to look at. Here was a man who might have remained nothing more than a forgotten painter. Yet in obscurity, bitterness festered. His rejection by the world of art pushed him toward another stage entirely, the political theater where he would find an audience for his fury. The photos from his Vienna years are haunting not only because they show us what he was, but because they show us what the world almost allowed him to remain, irrelevant. Joseph Stalin, too, knew obscurity before power. Rare photographs exist of him not as the stern leader of the Soviet Union but as a young poet publishing verses in Georgian newspapers. In those images, he is thin-faced, soft-eyed, often posed with fellow intellectuals. The man who would one day sign the orders for mass purges was once a struggling writer, earning praise for delicate poems about nature and love. It is jarring to see this version of Stalin, sensitive, artistic, almost gentle, when we know what came later. His obscurity tells us that history often turns its most fragile dreamers into its most ruthless rulers. The photographs of young Stalin as a poet are a chilling reminder of how easily one path can give way to another. Nelson Mandela's early years, though filled with promise, were also marked by struggle and obscurity. Before prison transformed him into a symbol of global resistance, he was a young man working odd jobs to survive. Rare photographs show him in the late 1930s and early 1940s, dressed modestly, standing with groups of friends or co-workers. He worked as a night watchman, a clerk, and even as a cleaner, struggling to pay rent and tuition. These images strip away the aura of inevitability around his later greatness. Mandela's obscurity was marked by uncertainty, by the everyday burdens of finding food, paying bills, and keeping hope alive. It was in these forgotten years, captured in rare photographs, that the character of the man was forged, through endurance, not glory. Volodymyr Zelensky is another striking example of obscurity captured before fame. Today, the world knows him as the wartime president of Ukraine, standing defiantly against invasion. But rare images from his earlier life show him as a young comedian on stage, dressed in outlandish costumes, performing sketches for laughter. Photographs of him playing piano with his feet, hosting television shows, and acting in romantic comedies seem almost surreal when viewed through the lens of his later destiny. At the time, he was simply an entertainer, struggling to make his mark in the crowded world of performance. The man the world would later call a modern Churchill was once a face in the comedy circuit, unknown outside his country. His obscurity is captured not in dusty archives but in bright stage lights, in laughter rather than solemnity. These photos remind us that history sometimes plucks its leaders from the most unlikely stages. Mahatma Gandhi's obscurity came during his years in London as a young law student and later in South Africa, where he was far from the saintly figure of Indian independence. Rare photographs show him dressed awkwardly in Western suits, sometimes appearing timid and unsure of himself. He struggled with shyness, often too nervous to speak in public, sometimes ridiculed for his foreign manners. These photographs capture a man who seemed ill-suited for leadership. And yet, it was during these obscure years, working small legal cases, enduring discrimination, and slowly finding his voice, that Gandhi's philosophy of resistance began to take shape. The obscurity was not wasted, it was the crucible in which his resolve was formed. Abraham Lincoln, remembered as the great emancipator, spent much of his youth in poverty and obscurity. Though photographs from his earliest years are scarce, the surviving images of his young adulthood show a gaunt, awkward man with little polish. Before his rise in politics, he worked as a farm laborer, a rail splitter, a store clerk. His early photographs reveal none of the gravitas of the president who would guide America through civil war. Instead, they show a man whose hands bore the marks of hard labor, whose suit hung awkwardly on his tall frame. Lincoln's obscurity was filled with toil, with failures in business, and with electoral defeats. His rare early photographs are important precisely because they remind us how much struggle preceded his greatness. Even figures like Winston Churchill faced obscurity. Before he became the bulldog of Britain, he faced failures that nearly ended his career. Rare photographs of him as a young journalist and soldier, awkwardly posed in military attire or standing beside men who overshadowed him, capture a man desperate for recognition. He failed in politics repeatedly, ridiculed by peers, dismissed as a loud and unreliable figure. These obscure years, visible in rare images, show a Churchill far removed from the iconic wartime leader. They remind us that obscurity is often a long shadow that leaders must walk through before they find their moment. What binds these rare photographs of obscurity together is the sense of fragility. They show us that history's giants were once invisible, struggling, uncertain. They remind us that greatness is rarely a straight line, it is instead a messy path filled with rejection, laughter, failure, and persistence. To look at these photos is to see the cracks through which destiny seeped, the overlooked lives that could have ended without ever touching history. In these rare images of obscurity, we find perhaps the most powerful truth, that the difference between an unknown figure and a world leader is often a single twist of fate. Some of the rarest and most striking photographs of future leaders are not taken in palaces, parliaments, or presidential offices, but in the streets, the basements, the lecture halls, and the gatherings where rebellion first took shape. Before they commanded nations, many of them were outsiders, activists, even fugitives, standing on the wrong side of power. Their early photographs as radicals are electric with energy, faces half hidden in crowds, fists raised, banners unfurled. These images remind us that leadership is often born in protest, that the hands which later sign laws and treaties once clutched placards or leaflets, trembling not from power but from fear and adrenaline. To look at these photographs is to glimpse the dangerous moment when history's giants were still only troublemakers, hunted, ignored, or dismissed. Che Guevara is perhaps the most famous example. Long before his portrait adorned walls and T-shirts, there were photographs of him as a young doctor in training, and then as a restless traveler in South America. But the most haunting photographs come later, when he is captured alongside Fidel Castro during the Cuban Revolution, his eyes blazing with radical conviction. The photographs show him not as an icon, but as a man on the run, dirty from the jungle, his rifle slung casually across his shoulder. These images are a reminder that before Che became a symbol, he was simply a radical who believed that the world could be remade through fire. His activism was raw, unpolished, yet so powerful that it drew others to his side. The photos capture that spark in its earliest form, dangerous and intoxicating. Martin Luther King Jr., remembered now as the great orator of civil rights, appears in early photographs as a young preacher, quietly standing in church halls or walking among protesters. In one rare image, he marches arm in arm with activists, his face still youthful, his suit slightly oversized, his expression calm but determined. These early photos capture not the grandeur of the "I have a dream" speech, but the dangerous beginnings, when his activism made him a target, when his name was barely known outside local circles, when the risks he took could have ended his life before history remembered him. The images are powerful because they show King not as a myth but as a man willing to step into danger long before the world listened. Indira Gandhi also appears in rare early photographs that reveal her radical streak. As the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, she was born into politics, but her own activism took root in India's independence movement. Photographs of her as a young woman show her standing among crowds of demonstrators, her posture stiff, her face serious, often dressed in simple clothing that marked her solidarity with the people. These images do not yet suggest the prime minister she would become, but they reveal her role as an agitator, a woman learning the art of resistance through practice, not through power. In these photographs, she is not yet the calculating leader of later years, but a participant in something larger, a radical voice in a country straining for freedom. Even Nelson Mandela, often remembered through his dignified later photographs, appears in rare images as a young activist and radical. Before he became a global symbol of reconciliation, he was photographed in the 1950s and early 1960s as a young lawyer and leader of the African National Congress, organizing strikes, speaking at rallies, and, eventually, plotting sabotage. Photographs from this time capture him in sharp suits, his expression fierce, his gestures animated. These were the years when his activism made him an enemy of the state, when he lived in hiding, constantly pursued by authorities. The photographs of Mandela in his radical youth remind us that he was once considered dangerous, even criminal, before time rebranded him as heroic. There are also photographs of women like Rosa Luxemburg, whose radical activism in early 20th century Europe marked her as one of the most dangerous thinkers of her time. Images of her in crowded meetings, notebook in hand, hair pulled tightly back, show not a politician in power but an agitator, a voice unsettling empires. Though she was ultimately executed for her radicalism, her photographs capture the essence of what it means to be an activist, to speak when silence is demanded, to stand when submission is safer. Angela Davis, though from a later era, provides another striking example of activism captured in photographs. Images of her at protests, with her iconic afro, her fist raised in solidarity, represent the power of radical imagery itself. Before she became a professor, an author, a global symbol of justice, she was photographed as a fugitive, wanted by the FBI, her image plastered across posters not as a leader but as a threat. The photographs of her as an activist embody the tension of obscurity and notoriety, a young woman standing against the weight of the state, her very existence branded radical. The radical stage of leaders' lives is often the most dangerous, the most uncertain, and the most easily erased. These rare photographs matter because they capture the moment before history accepted them, when they were still voices in the wilderness, facing the possibility of imprisonment, exile, or death. The images are filled with contradictions, a young Mandela in a suit branded as a terrorist, a young king in a church hall branded as an agitator, a young Guevara with a rifle branded as a threat. The world saw them as dangerous before it saw them as necessary. To view these photographs today is to be confronted with the fragility of movements. They remind us that activism is not always glamorous, that radicals are often ordinary young people driven by conviction, captured in photographs that only later become historical documents. These rare images force us to remember that before they held office or power, many leaders were hunted, beaten, silenced, or mocked. Their activism made them outsiders first. Power came later. What makes these images so unforgettable is the tension between their vulnerability and their defiance. They are faces caught in transition, no longer anonymous, not yet legendary. To see them is to feel history in motion, to watch the spark before the flame, to recognize the radical energy that frightened the powerful and inspired the powerless. And perhaps the most unsettling truth these photographs whisper is this: every leader we know today was once a radical someone tried to silence. One of the most fascinating things about rare photographs of future leaders is how often they reveal lives that feel strangely ordinary, even playful, long before history took them seriously. These images show presidents and revolutionaries in unexpected jobs, side hustles, or moments when their talents had nothing to do with politics at all. To see them in these roles is to see history's mask slip, to catch a glimpse of leaders as entertainers, athletes, laborers, or dreamers. It is also a reminder that greatness is not always obvious, sometimes it hides behind the most unlikely performances. Ronald Reagan is perhaps the most famous example. Before he became the 40th President of the United States, he was a Hollywood actor, a face on movie posters rather than campaign banners. Rare photographs capture him on film sets in the 1930s and 1940s, dressed as cowboys, soldiers, and romantic leads. In one iconic image, Reagan leans casually on a studio prop, flashing the same easy smile that later became his political trademark. These photographs are uncanny because they show how the skills of performance, memorization, charisma, the ability to project sincerity, later became political tools. Reagan's unexpected job as an actor was no detour, it was training for the stage of the presidency. Volodymyr Zelensky, decades later, lived a similar contradiction. Before he became known as the face of defiance against invasion, he was a comedian and actor in Ukraine, leading a troupe and performing skits that often poked fun at authority. Rare photographs and television stills capture him playing absurd characters, standing on brightly lit stages, or even, famously, performing a piano routine with his feet. To look at these images today is surreal. The man who would one day address parliaments around the world in military green was once photographed in outlandish costumes, his face painted for comic effect. These photos do more than amuse, they show that his skill in connecting with audiences, in blending humor with sincerity, began long before politics claimed him. His unexpected job in entertainment became the unlikely foundation of his leadership style. Pope Francis also had an unexpected early job, one that is rarely mentioned in formal biographies but is immortalized in anecdote and rare photographs. Before he became head of the Catholic Church, Jorge Mario Bergoglio worked as a nightclub bouncer in Buenos Aires. While no official photos from this time are widely circulated, there are images of the young man in casual attire, leaning on friends at dances, looking nothing like the pontiff he would become. These glimpses of his youth remind us that before he was seen as a spiritual father to millions, he was simply a young man trying to find his place, working jobs that kept him grounded among ordinary people. His later reputation for humility and connection with everyday life feels less surprising when viewed through this lens. Xi Jinping, now one of the most powerful figures in the world, also has rare photographs from a very different chapter of his life. During China's Cultural Revolution, as a teenager, he was sent to the countryside for re-education. Photographs of the young Xi show him in rough work clothes, standing among villagers, his hands dirty from agricultural labor. These images contrast sharply with the carefully staged photographs of him as China's leader. They reveal a young man who once shoveled grain, lived in caves, and struggled to survive in rural isolation. The photographs are important because they show how his later image of resilience and discipline was not only cultivated but lived. His unexpected job in the countryside was not glamorous, but it marked him deeply, shaping the way he later projected himself to the world. Even Margaret Thatcher, long before she became the formidable Iron Lady, worked unexpected jobs in her youth. Rare photographs show her as a young chemistry researcher, wearing a lab coat, hair neatly tied back, conducting experiments. These images of Thatcher in a laboratory, focused on test tubes rather than parliamentary debates, are startling because they show an alternate version of her life, a path she might have pursued if politics had not taken hold. Her scientific training influenced her pragmatism and her preference for clear, uncompromising solutions. The photographs remind us that her unexpected early career was not wasted but carried into her political mindset. And then there is Mikhail Gorbachev, whose unexpected talent was in theater and public speaking competitions. Rare images from his student years show him standing confidently before audiences, reciting poetry and speeches with dramatic flair. These photographs capture a man who loved words and performance, a talent that later became instrumental in his ability to communicate reformist ideas during the twilight of the Soviet Union. In his youthful images, one can see the glimmer of glasnost long before the term was coined. Even figures remembered for their severity reveal surprising talents in rare photographs. Joseph Stalin, for instance, was once captured with a guitar, part of his youthful involvement in Georgian cultural circles. Although his later image was carefully constructed to erase such softness, the photographs remain, a dictator once photographed in a moment of unexpected creativity. Similarly, rare images of Richard Nixon playing piano at gatherings, or Dwight Eisenhower painting quietly in retirement, remind us that behind the stern masks of politics were hidden talents that rarely reached the public eye. What makes these unexpected jobs and talents so compelling is the way they reframe our understanding of leadership. They remind us that the men and women who later became synonymous with power once lived lives of ordinary striving, of hobbies and side work that seemed disconnected from politics but were, in fact, preparing them. Reagan's acting taught him performance, Zelensky's comedy taught him connection, Thatcher's science taught her precision, Xi's farm work taught him discipline. These rare photographs show us that nothing is wasted. The unexpected jobs and hidden talents are not distractions from their stories but essential parts of them. Looking at these images, the viewer is left with a sense of wonder. How many other comedians, actors, laborers, or bouncers walk among us today, unaware that their seemingly ordinary talents will one day be recast as training for greatness? These rare photographs of unexpected lives suggest that history often finds its leaders not where we expect them, but in the overlooked details of the everyday. Power often seems to rewrite the past, smoothing away contradictions and reshaping memories to fit the official story. But rare photographs from the youth of world leaders often reveal something that history prefers to forget: the surprising friendships, the unlikely alliances, and the casual connections that existed long before politics hardened people into rivals or enemies. To see future adversaries standing side by side, smiling, laughing, even embracing, is to feel the strangeness of history in motion. These photographs remind us that before ideology divided them, before ambition drove them apart, many of history's giants were simply companions, classmates, or allies, unaware of how destiny would turn them against one another. One of the most striking examples comes from early American politics, where John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon appear together in photographs from the late 1940s and 1950s. At the time, they were both young congressmen, ambitious, eager to climb the political ladder. In rare images, they can be seen shaking hands warmly, laughing in private moments, even sharing a stage as allies during bipartisan events. These photos shock us today, knowing that just a decade later the two men would face each other in one of the most bitterly contested presidential elections in U.S. history. The images of Kennedy and Nixon smiling side by side capture a moment before rivalry consumed their relationship, a reminder that even bitter enemies once shared the same air, the same ambitions, and sometimes even the same camaraderie. Winston Churchill, who would one day stand as the implacable foe of Adolf Hitler, had early photographs in which he appears with German leaders during diplomatic exchanges long before the Nazi rise. Though Churchill himself was skeptical of Germany even in youth, these images of him casually interacting with German officials are unsettling in retrospect. They reveal that the world of politics is fluid, that enemies can sometimes pass through each other's lives as acquaintances before history solidifies their roles. The photos of Churchill in such company do not suggest friendship, but they remind us of the strange intersections that occur in the years before history fixes people into place. Saddam Hussein also offers a chilling example. Rare photographs from his youth in political circles in the Middle East show him in the company of men who were once his comrades but later became bitter rivals or even victims. His early alliances within the Ba'ath Party were marked by brotherhood and revolutionary zeal, captured in photographs of young men standing shoulder to shoulder. Yet many of those men would later be purged or executed under his regime. These images, smiling and casual, are haunting because they reveal the fragility of political friendship, the way shared ambition can so easily give way to paranoia and betrayal. In Britain, photographs of a young Elizabeth II, long before she ascended to the throne, show her surrounded by friends at dances and social outings. Among them were figures who would later become politicians, generals, even critics of the monarchy. These rare images remind us that leaders often begin their lives in the same social circles as those who will later oppose them. For Elizabeth, the photographs capture a girl on the cusp of unimaginable responsibility, laughing with friends who at the time had no idea they were in the company of a future queen. The contrast between the carefree teenager in those images and the monarch she became is profound. Even Joseph Stalin, in his revolutionary youth, appears in photographs with fellow activists who at the time were allies in the struggle against the Russian monarchy. These men posed with him in group portraits, arms folded, eyes burning with conviction. Yet decades later, many of those same comrades were executed during Stalin's purges. To look at those photographs is to feel the weight of irony and tragedy. Smiling allies became doomed victims, captured forever in a single frame of fellowship that history would later transform into betrayal. Mao Zedong, too, appears in rare photographs with early comrades in the Chinese Communist movement, men who laughed with him, strategized with him, and believed in him. Yet many of those faces would not survive the internal purges and political storms that followed. The photographs freeze them in a moment of harmony, but the viewer cannot help but see them as ghosts, smiling on the edge of their destruction. These images remind us that leadership often demands sacrifices that consume friendships, that power devours those closest to it first. Even in the United States, rare images of Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover together before their presidencies reveal a surprising camaraderie. Photographs show them seated side by side at events, smiling, even appearing cooperative. Yet history remembers them as bitterly opposed, with Hoover resenting Roosevelt's landslide victory and Roosevelt dismantling much of Hoover's legacy. The photographs of the two men together remind us that rivalry is often born out of proximity, that the closer two ambitious people are, the more inevitable their clash becomes. What makes these rare photographs so compelling is the contradiction they contain. We know the outcomes: wars fought, friendships betrayed, alliances shattered, yet the photographs capture the before, the fleeting moment of humanity that history erases. Kennedy and Nixon laughing together, Stalin's comrades smiling before their executions, Saddam standing shoulder to shoulder with men he would later kill, a young queen dancing with friends before the crown consumed her. All of these images show that history is not as neat as it appears in textbooks. Behind every rivalry is a forgotten photograph of friendship. The photographs of future leaders and their unexpected companions unsettle us because they collapse the distance between friend and foe, ally and rival. They show that enemies are not always born but made, that friendships can sour under the weight of ambition, that history's great divides often begin in moments of closeness. To see these leaders in such images is to realize that the line between loyalty and betrayal is thinner than we imagine. These photographs freeze the fragile balance before the break, before destiny turns smiles into scowls, handshakes into confrontations, laughter into silence. They are visual reminders that in the secret prehistories of power, everyone is someone's friend, until history decides otherwise. For every photograph of a leader exuding strength, there are rarer, quieter images that show the opposite, moments of frailty, of sickness, of fear, of uncertainty. These photographs are powerful precisely because they contradict the myth of invincibility that leaders carefully build around themselves. They reveal that before the image of authority hardened, there were times when even history's strongest figures were fragile, wounded, or dependent. These rare photographs of vulnerability remind us that greatness is often born from weakness, that behind every iron mask lies a human being who has known pain, loss, or defeat. To see them at their most vulnerable is to feel history tilt, as if the giants of the world suddenly look small again. Take Winston Churchill, often remembered as the bulldog of Britain, the man who never wavered in the face of Nazi aggression. Few recall that as a child and young man, he was frail, often sickly, plagued by bouts of pneumonia and poor health. Early photographs show him looking pale, slight, and uncertain, far removed from the robust, cigar-smoking statesman he later projected. These photographs of a weak and delicate Churchill remind us that his legendary toughness was not innate but forged in defiance of his own fragility. They whisper that the resilience we admire was born from a life lived on the edge of vulnerability. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's photographs tell an even more dramatic story. Before polio struck, images of him show a tall, vigorous man, full of confidence. But the rare photographs after his illness reveal a different picture: FDR struggling with braces, supported by aides, or seated in a wheelchair he preferred the public never to see. These photographs were carefully hidden during his presidency, yet they exist, and when viewed today, they reveal a side of Roosevelt that history concealed, a leader whose greatest strength came from his confrontation with weakness. The man who led a nation through depression and war was also a man who had to relearn how to stand, how to move, how to endure. His vulnerability became his strength, and the rare photographs of him in those moments carry more weight than any image of him behind a podium. Joseph Stalin, so often depicted as the unshakable iron ruler of the Soviet Union, has rare photographs from his youth that capture vulnerability in another form, poverty and hardship. In some of the earliest known images, he is thin, underdressed, and clearly struggling with illness in his early years. His smallpox scars, visible even in some later photographs, marked him with a reminder of his own mortality. The dictator who later insisted on projecting absolute control once bore the visible evidence of vulnerability on his skin. The photographs are haunting because they reveal that the man who made others live in fear was once marked by the fear of death himself. Mikhail Gorbachev's rare photographs also reveal moments of vulnerability, though of a different kind. In images from his rural youth, he appears as a boy in worn clothing, thin and weary, helping his family survive through harsh agricultural labor. These photographs capture not physical illness but the vulnerability of poverty. They show a child who knew hunger, who knew the fragility of survival in a world without security. Later, as leader of the Soviet Union, his policies would open the country to reform and change, but the photographs of his vulnerable youth remind us that even the architects of global change were once children living in uncertainty, their futures far from guaranteed. Even Adolf Hitler, who projected such force and control in adulthood, has photographs that reveal an unexpected vulnerability. In certain rare wartime images from World War I, he appears gaunt, exhausted, slumped beside his fellow soldiers in the mud of the trenches. There is no fire in his expression, no hint of command, only the blank fatigue of a man surviving day by day. These images shock precisely because they are so ordinary. They reveal Hitler as a soldier vulnerable to cold, hunger, and fear, before his name became synonymous with terror. The photographs disturb us because they remind us that even the most destructive figures were once subject to the same fragility as everyone else. And then there are the photographs of leaders in private, personal vulnerability, images rarely seen because they do not fit the official narrative. Indira Gandhi, remembered as India's powerful prime minister, appears in some rare candid photographs after the death of her son Sanjay, her face marked with visible grief, her posture bent, her eyes distant. These moments of vulnerability, captured by cameras not meant for propaganda, show the toll of personal tragedy on a leader so often remembered for her hardness. The vulnerability of grief is etched into those rare photographs, revealing the cost of power on the most intimate human level. Even more striking are the rare photographs of leaders who were caught in defeat. Napoleon III, after the Franco-Prussian War, was photographed in exile, aged and diminished, his power stripped away. These images are powerful because they remind us that vulnerability is not only about sickness or youth but about the loss of power itself. Leaders who once commanded nations can be captured, in a single photograph, looking broken, humiliated, or forgotten. These rare photographs of vulnerability change the way we understand history. They remind us that the figures who appear carved in stone were once soft, fragile, and exposed. They show us that resilience is not about never breaking but about breaking and continuing anyway. The images are powerful because they contradict the myths we have built: Churchill as weak, Roosevelt as disabled, Stalin as scarred, Gandhi as timid, Mandela as weary, leaders we imagine as invincible shown as deeply human. To look at these rare photographs is to feel something almost uncomfortable: empathy. The men and women who shaped nations, who sometimes destroyed them, who often seemed larger than life, are suddenly seen as ordinary people caught in moments of weakness. Their faces look like ours, their expressions mirror our own moments of doubt and pain. And in that instant, history feels closer, more intimate, and more tragic. These photographs remind us that vulnerability is not an exception to power, it is the hidden foundation of it. There is a moment in every leader's life when obscurity fades and the outlines of destiny sharpen. Rare photographs capture this fragile threshold, the instant when an ordinary face begins to harden into the public image that history will never forget. These are the photographs of becoming, when childhood, youth, and anonymity are left behind, and the figure we now know begins to emerge. They are not yet the iconic portraits of power, but they are no longer casual snapshots either. They exist in the in-between space, when the individual still belongs to the world of everyday life but is already stepping onto the stage of history. To see these photographs is to witness transformation itself, the moment a person begins to turn into a symbol. Nelson Mandela's transitional photographs are among the most poignant. There are rare images of him leaving prison after 27 years, his raised fist captured in one of the most famous frames of the 20th century. But the images leading up to that moment, his early campaign photographs, his rare portraits taken while in hiding, reveal the slow transformation from activist to icon. In them, Mandela is not yet the universally beloved statesman, but his face is already etched with the quiet authority of a man who has endured. These rare photographs show us the bridge between obscurity and immortality, when the lines of hardship began to turn into the features of legend. Margaret Thatcher's becoming was also captured in photographs. As a young woman, she was photographed in modest attire, smiling stiffly at campaign events during her early bids for Parliament. These images reveal someone still dismissed by many in her own party, her future underestimated. And yet, in the set of her jaw and the certainty in her eyes, one can already sense the iron that would later earn her a nickname and a reputation. The rare campaign photographs of Thatcher are remarkable not for what they show outright but for what they hint at, the gathering force of determination that was about to break through barriers and reshape Britain. Barack Obama's transitional photographs are striking in their familiarity. Long before the dazzling stage of the 2008 campaign, he was photographed shaking hands at local events, standing at lecterns in small Illinois halls, speaking to rooms where half the seats were empty. These rare images of him as a young senator or even earlier as a community organizer reveal the slow construction of the persona we now associate with hope and eloquence. He is thinner, less polished, sometimes awkward in these images, but the charisma is already flickering to life. The rare photographs show him not yet commanding the world's attention but rehearsing for it, his image slowly becoming the one history now holds in its collective memory. Mikhail Gorbachev's rise is also documented in rare photographs that show the evolution of an ordinary Soviet official into the face of reform and, eventually, the man who presided over the end of the Cold War. In early images, he stands in the background of official groups, smiling modestly, barely noticeable among more senior party members. But as the years progress, the photographs capture him moving steadily toward the center, his expression sharpening, his posture more assured. By the time he is photographed as General Secretary, the birthmark on his head and the calm but determined look in his eyes have already become iconic. The photographs chart the process of a man becoming more than himself, his very image transformed into a symbol of an era. Even Adolf Hitler's photographs reveal this unsettling transition. In the 1920s, rare images capture him speaking to small crowds, his hair still unkempt, his suit ill-fitting, his gestures more awkward than commanding. But slowly, through photographs staged for propaganda, his image begins to change. He is shown standing tall, framed against flags, his expression deliberately fierce. These photographs are chilling not just because of what they show but because of what they helped create. The transition from obscure agitator to icon of terror was built not only on words but on images that deliberately shaped his persona. The rare transitional photographs remind us that even infamy must be constructed, step by step, frame by frame. John F. Kennedy's journey from decorated young veteran to political icon is perhaps one of the most carefully documented. Rare campaign photographs from his early congressional runs show him shaking hands with factory workers, standing at small-town podiums, his face boyish but already magnetic. The charm that later dazzled television audiences in 1960 was present, but raw, in these images. As the photographs progress through the late 1940s and 1950s, the transformation is unmistakable, the hair more polished, the smile more assured, the gaze more direct. By the time Kennedy faced Nixon in the first televised presidential debate, the photographic record had already carried him across the threshold from young politician to national icon. Even leaders outside the Western spotlight show this transitional moment. Mao Zedong, photographed in the 1930s and 1940s, appears at first as a simple revolutionary in ill-fitting clothes, blending in with comrades. But as he consolidates power, the photographs begin to change. He is shown in carefully staged group images, slightly elevated, his expression stern, his posture commanding. By the time he is photographed at Tiananmen in 1949, his image has already become monumental, the man transformed into the father of a nation. The rare photographs of his becoming are striking because they reveal how ordinary he once looked, and how carefully the persona of Mao was constructed through imagery. What unites all these transitional photographs is the sense of inevitability they seem to carry when viewed with hindsight. At the time, they were simply campaign flyers, family snapshots, or propaganda posters. But today, we cannot look at them without seeing the foreshadowing of legend. They capture the moment when obscurity slips away, when the private face hardens into the public one, when the individual begins to stand not only for themselves but for an entire people, an entire movement, an entire history. These photographs haunt us because they show the becoming in progress. They reveal that the iconic images we take for granted, the portraits in textbooks, the statues, the official photographs, were not born fully formed. They grew out of these rare, awkward, transitional images, where the weight of destiny is just beginning to settle on their shoulders. To look at them is to witness the exact moment when a person begins to dissolve into myth, when a human face starts turning into a symbol.